I'm the author of Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. That's this book. This book is my analysis of 9/11, what it was all about, mainly how it's unique in the literature about 9/11 as I talk about who did it, who set it up, and why they did it. And the material in the little book is based on all the original articles that I wrote, the research articles that I wrote. And in this book, they're presented. This is Solving 9/11, the original articles. All the articles are presented from September 2001 through April 2012 when the book was printed. My background, my credentials are that I was an investigative journalist working in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened. And as fate had it, we were passing through New York City early in the morning on 9/11, just a few hours before it all happened. And before I worked as an investigative journalist, I worked for IBM, but I went to school at University of California in Davis and Santa Cruz, and I got my degree in history, with Middle East being my region, my specialty, and in particular, my focus was on Israel and Palestine. And prior to all that, I grew up in Schaumburg, Illinois, where I was an Eagle Scout and recipient of the God and Country Award. So the question is, why is 9/11 truth so important now, 15 years later? A lot of people will say, well, that was a long time ago, it was 15 years ago, it's all over, they're dead, they're buried, and Osama bin Laden's been killed. So what difference does it make? Well, it's very much like the 9/11, like the John F. Kennedy murder. Why does the murder of John F. Kennedy still matter today, 53 years later? Well, the murder of Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. And the powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. The man raising his hand being one of the main cover-uppers. And a coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic country means that the succeeding government is illegitimate. U.S. military involvement in Vietnam spanned a period of 2 decades, from 55 to 75. But of course, it spiked after the murder of John F. Kennedy, because John F. Kennedy wanted to actually pull the troops out of Vietnam. The Kennedy assassination matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission, mainly that one man did it, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that there was no conspiracy behind his actions. The Kennedy assassination matters because the mainstream media continues to support and even endorse the official version. The Kennedy assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed President Kennedy are still in charge to this very day. Of course, the American people have historically been of the opinion that there were others involved, that there was a conspiracy behind the murder of Kennedy. So, why does 9/11 truth matter? Here we are almost 15 years later. For all the same reasons, of course. 9/11 truth matters because the government continues to lie about what happened to this very day. These two men being of course, the administrations since 9/11. And 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of costly wars. Actually, the war on terror brought us 9/11, but I'll get to that. 9/11 truth matters because for 15 years, the controlled media has pushed a false story, a false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing evidence that disproves the official myth. The American people have, again, historically been of the opinion that the government has lied to them about 9/11. This is a poll done by New York Times and CBS, and they were asked if they thought that if the Bush administration had been telling the truth about 9/11. And in 2002, 3/4 of the population thought that the Bush administration was mostly lying or hiding something. And in 2004, it went up. In 2006, it went even higher. And when they found that only 16% of the population thought the administration was telling the truth, they stopped polling. This is our political predicament in a nutshell. If the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means that they, the government and the media, are controlled by the very people who carried out 9/11. Now, you can see that logically as a deduction, but that's a very serious state of affairs. So why did the government and media cover up the truth about what happened on 9/11? Well, for 3 basic reasons. 1, to protect the real culprits from being identified. 2, to prevent the official myth from being exposed as a pack of lies. And 3, to advance the fraudulent war on terror, the Zionist war agenda being waged by the United States, which was the primary reason for 9/11. Now, when I use the word Zionist, that's a political term. It's an ideology based on the concept of Jewish nationalism. So Israel is the Zionist state, and the ideology that the Jewish people should have a state only for themselves, and that is Zionism in a nutshell. Now, 9/11 was a highly sophisticated false flag terror atrocity designed to instill fear and rage in the population in order to compel U.S. public opinion to support the Israeli Zionist war agenda, known as the Global War on Terror. Now, starting the war on terror was the real reason for the false flag attacks of 9/11. Here is a sign from San Francisco, and the fraudulent war on terror is based on the myth of 9/11. Here's the Zionist connection. Here we see at the Pentagon in January 2002, you see the Israeli Chief of Staff, this is the Israeli senior military officer, meeting with the Zionist neocons, namely Paul Wolfowitz to his left, across the table, Rabbi Dov Zakheim, and to his right, Douglas Feith. These are three of the highest players in what they call the Defense Policy Board. These are the Zionist neocons. These men are Zionists. The three of them are Jewish, but they're Zionists. They're dedicated to protecting and serving the state of Israel. And he's the Israeli Chief of Staff, and they're meeting at the Pentagon. What were they talking about? They were talking about what the U.S. military response should be after 9/11. And as you see, the war on terror, of course, began about 3 weeks after 9/11. The Afghan people were completely puzzled. That 85% of the Afghan people had no idea why the Americans were in their country. They never associated the American presence in their country with 9/11. Because they were not given that propaganda. They just saw, here's another invading army. The Afghanistan war is currently costing U.S. taxpayers $4 million per hour. Again, that's $96 million a day. And so that basically, within a good week, the United States spends more money in Afghanistan than they do on Amtrak, for example, for a whole year. This photograph is of the American military concentration camp in occupied Iraq. The camp was called Camp Bucca. It was named after a fire marshal from New York City who died on 9/11. And the American military tried to link 9/11 with the operation in Iraq, although there was, of course, no real connection. Yet at this concentration camp here, they were developing what became the leadership of ISIS. All of the leaders of ISIS, like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, are graduates of this camp. The war on terror agenda was articulated by this general, Wesley Clark. In 2007, he was on the Amy Goodman show, and he spoke about this. And he said, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. One of the generals called me in. He said, sir, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. We're going to war with Iraq, I said. Why? I don't know, he said. I came back a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. As you can see, 5 of those countries have already been done. We have facilitated regime change in 5 of those countries and the division of those countries into parts. And that is the strategy that Israel has put forward since the 1980s to dominate the Middle East. It's called the Yinon Plan, named after the guy who wrote it, Oded Yinon. He's a strategist for the Likud party. And it was printed in a Hebrew magazine in 1982 called Kivunim. And thanks to an Israeli professor who thought that it was important for the non-Hebrew speaking world to understand, he translated this and it was published in America. And the Yinon Plan basically calls for breaking up the big Arab countries, the Middle Eastern countries, into statelets, ethnic statelets. And it's called Balkanization because it's exactly what was done in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a large, secular, socialist country that in 1990s, when we invaded in NATO and bombed the heck out of the place, they broke it into like 7 statelets along its regional lines. So that's the plan. And as you can see, Iraq there has been now fragmented into 3 countries. Syria is in the process of being devastated in the same way. Libya is broken, Sudan is broken, etc. This is the name of the game. And they want to break these countries up along religious lines, confessional lines, or ethnic lines. So in Saudi Arabia or in Iraq, they broke it up into the Shiite area, which is in the south, the Sunni areas to the west, and the Kurdish areas in the north. And I wanted to point out that the Kurdish area in the north is where most American soldiers are currently serving today, and that is also the region where the Rothschilds own the oil. The Rothschild family owns the oil of Kurdistan. And you can see that this quotation at the bottom is from the Yinon Plan. And it's interesting, they point out that they want to break these areas up into these ethnic statelets, but at the bottom it says, the dissolution of the military power of these states is the primary short-term target. Basically, dissolving the military in these countries. And what was the first thing the United States did when it went into Iraq? Dissolve the military. Now, this is a very interesting email from Hillary Clinton in 2012 when she was Secretary of State. This is from a recently revealed WikiLeaks transcript. And Secretary of State Clinton wrote that the best way to help Israel is to use force in Syria to overthrow the government. And that email from 2012 reveals that U.S. policy to violently overthrow the Syrian government has been pursued by the United States in order to support Israel. Of course, overthrowing the government of Bashar al-Assad, and it's a government, it's an elected government that was elected in June of 2014, and it makes no sense for America to be overthrowing countries, in the Middle East. It is not serving any American interest whatsoever, but it is fulfilling that Yinon Plan that Israel has. And for Israel, the 2 main confrontational states were Iraq and Syria. And again, our new Secretary of State, the current one, John Kerry, when he spends all his time on Syria, and when he talks about Syria as if he is the one who's calling the shots. Here, this is from May 3rd of this year. This is a quotation what he said. He said, if Assad's strategy is to somehow think he's going to just carve out Aleppo and carve out a section of the country, I got news for you and for him. This war doesn't end. As long as Assad is there, in power, the opposition is not going to stop fighting him one way or the other. Now, this is not the words of a person who's observing the conflict, trying to resolve the conflict. These are the words of a man who is calling the shots. Now, the question is whether the war on terror is a war against terror or a war of terror. And what we can clearly see, it's the latter. Terrorism has increased 4,500% since 9/11, with now something like 10 times as many people being killed in terrorist attacks today than there were in 2000. And this is just the data from 2014. Last year, 2015, was the worst year in history for terrorism deaths in both Afghanistan and Iraq, the 2 countries where the United States has fought most vigorously the war against terror. So it's extremely counterproductive, and it's extremely expensive. The United States is currently spending $400 million for every American victim of terrorism per year. So they say that you would have to increase that stack of bills 1,000 times more to reflect the scale of the difference. Now, this is a quotation from Dr. Alan Sabrowski, who was the Director of Studies at the U.S. Army War College. And in 2009, this scholar from the U.S. Army War College came out and validated my thesis with his writings. And he wrote this in 2009 in an article called Treason, Betrayal, and Deceit, 9/11 and Beyond. He said, the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, AIPAC and their cohorts through the mostly Jewish neocons in the Bush administration and back to the Israeli government. He said none of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. And the mastermind, or the architect, the man behind the war on terror, the most outspoken advocate of this doctrine, is this man in the foreground here. His name is Bibi Netanyahu. He's the current Prime Minister of Israel. He's the head of the Likud party since 1993. The other man is Ehud Olmert, and Ehud Olmert is a former prime minister. They're both in the Likud party, which is the party of terrorists. And it's interesting that Ehud Olmert was in New York City on September 11th, but his presence in New York City was kept out of the newspapers. 10 days later, he came back to New York and acted like the older brother of Giuliani. New York City and Jerusalem are, in fact, sister cities. And at the time, he was the mayor of Jerusalem. So he came to basically, support Giuliani and give him advice. But the question is, if he was there on September 10th and September 11th, why has that been kept secret? What was he doing in New York City on September 11th and September 10th? And why was that kept away from the American people? This is the former Israeli Prime Minister also, Ehud Barak. He's also former Israeli Chief of Staff. And on September 11th, he was in the London studio of the BBC World, which is the largest English-speaking broadcast network in the world. And he was, before the towers even fell, he gave his analysis of what we were experiencing. The towers had been struck, but they had not yet fallen. And he said that the world will never be the same from today on. He says, we know who's behind this. This is Osama bin Laden. And we know where Osama bin Laden is. He went on to conclude, now it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. And that is the basic Zionist analysis of what happened on 9/11. And that has been the myth ever since. Now, what's Ehud Barak's relationship to Netanyahu? Well, they were both in a secret elite commando force called the Sayeret Matkal. And when Netanyahu was in this commando force, his commando leader was Ehud Barak. And they did operations together, for example, the Entebbe hijacking. And that was the hijacking where Netanyahu's brother was killed. And this commando force that they belong to is called an independent covert commando force because it serves directly under the Israeli Chief of Staff and military intelligence. On 9/11, the New York Times put out this edition, and in the first headline you see there are basically 3 untruths. Hijack jets, destroy Twin Towers, and hit Pentagon in Day of Terror. First, there's no indication that a hijacked jet hit the Pentagon. There's also no indication that the planes were hijacked. The planes were rather drones. And thirdly, the planes did not destroy the World Trade Center. Explosives did. So it's a very complex and a very sophisticated crime that we're trying to wrap our heads around. And Larry Johnson, who was the director of counterterrorism at the State Department, said about 9/11, he said, we don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation. Some people will say, Mr. Bollyn, you're being anti-Semitic, you're blaming Israel for attacking America. Israel is our strategic ally, our special friend. They would never attack the United States. I would refer them to this incident in the Six-Day War in 1967 on June 8th, when Israeli military planes and ships bombed and attacked and tried to sink the USS Liberty. They killed 34 Americans, injured 171. This was an American spy ship in international waters off the coast of Egypt. And Israel, the Israeli military, knew it was an American ship and told the pilots, sink it with all hands lost. So when the Americans put life rafts into the water, the Israeli military boats, gunships, machine gunned the life rafts. So that the intention was that the ship should go to the bottom of the sea and all lives would be lost. But they failed. The ship was an old World War II ship that stayed afloat. But it's been a suppressed part of our history. It's not talked about. It's not taught in schools. You won't find out about it on television. 9/11 is very much like the murder of John F. Kennedy. And these are some quotes from a JFK researcher. He's talking about the JFK assassination, but these quotes are exactly appropriate as for 9/11 as well. Primarily, all the time it was obvious, it was blatantly obvious that it was a conspiracy. And secondly, the cover story was transparent and designed not to hold, to fall apart at the slightest scrutiny. And that's the 9/11 cover story. If you look at the 9/11 story, what the government tells you, you can pick it apart piece by piece. It comes apart at the seams immediately. This is a photograph, of course, of the pulverization of the 110 floors of one tower. And basically, we're looking at a situation where the towers were cooked to a very high temperature with this molten metal. It's full of the molten metal is found in all the dust. The people inside were being cooked above the crash zones, and then the towers were exploded. And everything that was on those floors, everything was pulverized. The war on terror has cost the United States, just the wars alone, $1.7 trillion. And it's important to understand that all of that money has been borrowed, meaning that the United States has become more indebted to, enslaved to, the banks that have lent the money to the government. But wait a minute, wait, just a second. What is the war on terror? And where did it come from? Where and when did Americans start behaving like this? You know, putting people in gulag archipelagos, you know, the kind of thing the Soviet Union had, torturing people, you know, depriving people of any due justice. Well, the war on terror is an Israeli stratagem pushed by Netanyahu since 1979 to bring the United States military into the Middle East to wage war on behalf of the Zionist state of Israel. And here's Mr. Netanyahu, after they had the conference in 1979 on international terrorism, where George Herbert Walker Bush spoke at the final session in July 1979. Then he cranked out a book with the speeches from that conference, and then he began pushing this doctrine called the War on Terror in books and articles and speeches. Here are two of the books that he wrote in the 1980s, Terrorism, How the West Can Win, and another one, Fighting Terrorism. And Netanyahu uses the word terrorist to delegitimize the Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. This is the wall that the Israelis have built across the Holy Land, separating the Jewish population from the Palestinian population. And these are a couple of Palestinian terrorists fighting against the Israeli occupation of their homeland. So 22 years after it was born at the Jerusalem Conference in 1979, the War on Terror became operational with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The ultimate purpose of 9/11 was to start the War on Terror. When it began, New York Times asked Mr. Netanyahu, how will this atrocity affect Israeli-American relations? And he blurted out, it's very good. He said, well, it's not very good, he said, but it'll generate immediate sympathy. And who would say, on that day, it was estimated that 20 to 30,000 people were dead in the ruins. Who would use the word good to describe that carnage, except somebody who saw some benefit to the atrocity? And he saw a benefit, all right. This is what he said a few years later, speaking in Hebrew at an Israeli college. He said, we, the Israelis, are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. Again, those are three things. Those are 3 or 4 things. Yet he merges them all into one thing, which is kind of a Freudian slip. And I want to point out that he is the chairman of the Likud party since 1993. Another interesting thing, I'll be pointing out some of the connections between some of the key players in the 9/11 saga here. And these are two of the most key players. It's Bibi Netanyahu on the left, obviously, and on the right is Larry Silverstein. Larry Silverstein is the person who owned basically all 3 buildings that fell that day. He had a 99-year lease on Towers 1 and 2, North Tower and South Tower, and he owned outright Building 7. Now, this is from an Israeli article from November of 2001, and they're talking about the fact that these men had a very, very close relationship. For years, Netanyahu and Silverstein have kept in close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was, he would always call. Their ties continued after Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996. Now, how did Larry Silverstein become the owner of these publicly owned towers? The World Trade Center the towers belonged to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a public facility. And the way it went was like this. Ronald Lauder, this man here, he's the son of Estee Lauder. He's very closely tied to Israeli intelligence. There's a school named the Lauder School of Government, which he funds at the Mossad's University in Herzliya. And he was made the director of Governor Pataki's privatization scheme in the year 2000, late 1990s. And he decided that they would privatize the World Trade Center and other places like Stewart Air Force Base, the former Stewart Air Force Base. That's important because both planes converged over Stewart Airport, the privately owned Stewart Airport, on their way to the towers, which is very appropriate, very much like the Operation Northwoods plan, that the planes actually landed someplace and their flight paths were continued by drone aircraft, a la Operation Northwoods. So after Mr. Ronald Lauder decided to privatize the World Trade Center, it then went to, the dossier then went to the head of the Port Authority, the man at the top right. His name is Lou Eisenberg. And Lou Eisenberg became then the person who would oversee the negotiations that led to Larry Silverstein getting the buildings. Now, Larry Silverstein did not have the wherewithal to really buy the World Trade Center. He put down $100 million of borrowed money from GMAC, which was being run by a friend of his. They gave him $100 million to put down, and that was the down payment. And after some very convoluted negotiations, the buildings, the World Trade Center, went to Larry Silverstein. So on July 24th, 2001, about 5 weeks before the towers fell, Larry Silverstein got the keys. And he said on that day, he said, I'm proud to assume the stewardship of the World Trade Center, one of New York's greatest jewels. 6 weeks later, this is what New York's jewels looked like, a pile of rubble. And the people that dealt with this pile of rubble said that all that was left of the World Trade Center was steel and dust. That's it. So now I'm going to talk about the evolution of the War on Terror. Where did the War on Terror come from? Who owns it? Who designed it? Whose strategy is it? Well, it all started with this man here, Menachem Begin. He's the Russian-born terrorist who came to Palestine in 1942. He became leader of the Irgun, which was a very radical terrorist group. And he ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946, which killed 93 people. That's pretty clearly terrorism. He created the Likud party in 1973 and became prime minister in 1977. And then he promptly invaded Lebanon in 78 and again in 1982, killing at least 20,000 people. The emblem of the Irgun is this image here on the screen. And it shows a concept called Eretz Israel. And that means in Hebrew, the land of Israel, or Greater Israel. The land of Israel for Zionists like Mr. Begin is basically the entire area that they can find written in the Bible that they can somehow attach to, that say that this is Israel. And so it goes from the River Nile, basically, to the River Euphrates. But here's what they thought in 1948. And it says, in Hebrew, by the gun, it's written in Hebrew, the only solution. In Hebrew, it's rak kach, only thus. Only by the gun will they be able to achieve this expansive territory that they aspire to. And this is all based, the Irgun is based on the hardline ideology of a man named Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky was the head of something called the New Zionist Organization in New York. He died in 1940, and when Jabotinsky died in 1940, it was taken over by Netanyahu's father. And this is the idea of the Greater Israel. This is from an article in a Hebrew Israeli website. It says what Israel's future borders will look like. Basically from the River Nile to the River Euphrates and everything in between. And it's interesting, when the United Nations first created the State of Israel by the partition plan in 1947, they partitioned Palestine between Israeli and Jewish groups, or Jewish and Palestinian groups. And the next day, Menachem Begin denounced it, saying, the partition of Palestine is illegal. It will never be recognized. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. And Eretz Israel will be restored to the people of Israel, all of it and forever. This is the ideology of the current state of Israel, of the Likud coalition. And the Likud party has ruled Israel since 1977. In 1948, this is the first Rothschild agent who became a head of the state of Israel. His name is David Ben Gurion. And 1 week after Israel was established with this conclusion, or the beginning of the war in 1948, he said to his military brass, he said, we, the Israelis, should prepare to go over on the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. He said the weak point was Lebanon. He said we can establish a Christian state in the south of that country. And he said we will smash the Arab Legion's strength and bomb Amman, that's Jordan, and eliminate Jordan. And then Syria will fall. If Egypt dares to fight, we will bomb Cairo and Alexandria. This is very aggressive talk coming from a little man in a little country that's just been created. But this is the name of the game. Here is Menachem Begin, and this is the King David Hotel that he oversaw the destruction of in 1946 and killed 93 people. This is very similar to 9/11, actually. And in what they were doing in this case is that this was British military headquarters, the King David Hotel, and the British had collected evidence in a raid, a cross-country raid, and they had gotten evidence that proved that all of the heads of the Zionist movement were involved in terrorism, even the heads of the Jewish agency, which meant that if justice was to be served, these men would be hanged. So in order to prevent the entire Zionist enterprise from going to the gallows, they destroyed the evidence and killed a lot of people. This is Shimon Peres, who has always had the opinion that Israel should frighten the West. This is the former Prime Minister of Israel, Moshe Sharett, 1955. He's speaking about Shimon Peres because they had just discovered and made public another false flag attack on America and Britain called the Lavon Affair, where these Mossad, these Israeli intelligence people, planted bombs in American and British buildings in Cairo, in Egypt. And what Moshe Sharett said, he said, Shimon Peres shares the same ideology as Lavon. He wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. And this is exactly what the war on terror is all about. Frightening us, scaring us into supporting a war agenda that benefits the state of Israel. And as you can see, this war agenda is getting more and more serious every day. The terrorism is becoming more frequent. This is going to be, I think, a very bad summer with a lot of terrorism. We've seen just like in the last couple days, incredible developments. So it's an ongoing thing, and the faster we come up to speed and understand what's going on, the better chance we have of surviving this. Here is Menachem Begin being interviewed by a British journalist, and he was asked in 1974, how does it feel, Mr. Begin, in the light of all that's going on, to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Begin laughed, and he said, in the Middle East? He said, in all the world, putting upon himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world. This is the man who founded the political party that is now controlling Israel. He admits to himself he's the father of terrorism. So when we call the Likud party the party of terrorists, it's not hyperbole. Here he was in 1977 when he became elected to the prime ministership in Israel. And this is the troika of terrorists that led the party in the very beginning. It's Menachem Begin in the middle, Yitzhak Shamir to the right, and Ariel Sharon to the left. If you remember 1982, Ariel Sharon was the butcher of Beirut. Here's Mr. Shamir, Yitzhak Shamir, and Shamir was in charge of another terrorist gang called the Stern Gang, or Lehi. And as head of the Stern Gang, he oversaw the murder of the United Nations mediator in Palestine. This man here in the photograph, his name is Folke Bernadotte. He's a royal guy from the Swedish royal family, the Bernadotte family. And he was sent there to the United Nations to try to make some viable solution to the partition plan of 1947 and the war that broke out in 48. And the problem was why Shamir killed him is because this man, the Swedish man, said that we can only solve this problem if we allow the Palestinian refugees to come back to their homes. Well, that makes sense, right? But that was anathema to the Zionists. They said, we cannot let any of these Palestinians come home. We're living in their homes now. So it had to be stopped. So they killed Folke Bernadotte in a Bonnie and Clyde style ambush in Jerusalem. And in that gang that killed Bernadotte was this man's father. This man is Ram Emanuel. His father is Benjamin Emanuel, a doctor in Chicago. This man is now the mayor of Chicago. But Ram Emanuel, as I said, his father was a member of the Stern Gang in Israel when they killed Bernadotte. And it was a small gang. And then in the 1950s, early 50s, he came to America. This Auerbach, his father, his original name was Auerbach, and he had these 3 kids. And Rahm Emanuel became the head Mossad agent in the White House during the time of Bill Clinton, and then he was the first person appointed by Barack Obama. He was chief of staff for Barack Obama, and he was Bill Clinton's special advisor. He was the Mossad man in the White House. He's also the guy who pushed NAFTA through. NAFTA in 1993. If you remember the election of 1992, NAFTA was the big issue. And when he came into the White House, he single-handedly pushed it through Congress. Odd. Is that an Israeli agenda? Getting NAFTA, destroying our manufacturing base? Seems to be. Here is the south of Lebanon that Menachem Begin tried to grab for Israel in 1978. They were only pushed, the Israelis only vacated from this area in 2002 due to the resistance of the Hezbollah group. So how did this idea evolve? In 1978, the 9/11 concept was started to be pushed by Israelis. And the guy that pushed it the most was this man, Arnon Milchan, or Milchan, some people say. He's a Hollywood producer today, but his very first movie was made in England and France. It's called The Medusa Touch. It starred Richard Burton. And the climactic scene in the movie is the 747 crashing into the Pan Am building. And the same year he made this movie, in 1978, here you see he's very buddy-buddy with Israel's defense minister, Ezer Weizman. Here they are preparing the props for that scene that they made when they made the movie. This is what I call Israeli ideation. What they're doing with this movie is they're putting out there into the public mind the idea that airplanes can be flying into high-rise buildings. And then in the year 2000, he made another film like this in which it was the World Trade Center was the target. And it was a passenger aircraft flying into the World Trade Center. This was a program, this was the pilot episode of a series called The Lone Gunman, which was a spin-off of The X-Files. And it was made by Rupert Murdoch and his partner, Arnon Milchan. And it was filmed in New York City, actually. They filmed this scene using helicopters flying at the World Trade Center. And then they, of course, used computer-generated imagery to put the plane in there. And it aired on TV, on Fox TV, in March 2001, and was seen by millions of people in the United States. Here is Arnon Milchan, the man in the middle, between his 2 buddies, Shimon Peres on one side and Bibi Netanyahu on the other. And it's reported that Milchan is one of the richest media moguls, or moguls in Hollywood. They say he's the number 2, I think. And they say he's worth $5.2 billion. But he has a long history of being a money launderer. If you read his biography, he's been laundering money for the South Africans and the Israelis for a long time. So the question is, really, whose money is it? Whose money is he using? Well, here's the Netanyahus, father and son. In 1976 to 78, Bibi Netanyahu worked for the Boston Consulting Group, which is a Rothschild-owned company in Boston. And in 1979, he went from the Rothschild firm back to Israel and started the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. And they had a conference in July of that year in which they began the big propaganda push, the media push, the political push for the war on terror in 1979. Most of you were kids then, I know. And here in 1980, we have the Isser Harel, the former head of the Mossad. He's the first chief of the Mossad, first chief of Shin Bet. He's a long-term Israeli intelligence expert. And he made a prediction to an American Zionist in 1980 that Arabs would attack the tallest building in New York. Here's what he said. The American, Michael Evans, asked him, "Do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why?" And he said, "I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism." La la la. And then as to the where, Isser Harel continued, "New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power." How amazing. What amazing prescience that this head of the Mossad knows that 21 years ahead of time, 21 years before, that Arabs would be attacking the World Trade Center. Now, that was his prediction, but oddly, he began putting that prediction into reality. He sent 2 of his head men, 2 of his chief men, these 2 guys, to New York in 1980, and they were given the task of getting the security contract for the World Trade Center. And they had a little company not theirs. It was Shaul Eisenberg's company. It's called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, and it was created especially for this purpose, to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. Now, they actually got it. In 1987, they had the contract, but somebody at the Port Authority discovered that the man that was the president of the company, the man with suspenders, is Shalom Ben-Dor here, that this man was convicted of murder in Israel. As a former head of Shin Bet, he had been involved in arresting some Palestinians for hijacking a bus. And when they got all the passengers off the bus, they had these Palestinian guys there that had been behind the attack. And his men in the field said, well, we got these guys, what do we do with them now? And he said, smash their heads with rocks. And so that's what they did, and it led to a legal case in Israel, and he was removed from his position and charged with their murder. And when the Americans discovered that history, they said, we can't have this guy running security at the World Trade Center. That doesn't go. So they tore up the contract. But had that contract not been torn up, 9/11 would have happened probably in the late 1980s or early 1990s at the latest. But they were stymied, they were stifled, they were prevented. So what did they do? They went to work for these guys. They went to work for Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. If you remember, Maurice Greenberg is the man who owned AIG, the insurance company that we bailed out for $183 billion in 2008. It's criminal. He was once asked by an employee, how much will it cost for us to go legal? And to be legal. And Maurice Greenberg said, if we were legal, we wouldn't be in business. And this is really important to understand. The American taxpayers bailed out his company for $183 billion. And when that money was transferred to his company, he just wrote checks to Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and the various companies, the banks that he had insured their profits. We were basically bailing out the biggest investment banks in America in 2008, 2009. Well, these two guys are partners in crime, partners in business. And Jules Kroll, his company, he had a company called Kroll Associates. And Kroll Associates got the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1993. And when Kroll Associates got the contract for the World Trade Center, these men were already working for him. Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor was working for the man on the top here. And so what they did is when the Israelis were thwarted from getting the security contract, they used like a Trojan horse mechanism and went through an American scion, an American helper, who then got them the contract, got them into the business. This is 1982. This is when the Israelis invaded Lebanon a second time. And here's Ariel Sharon, the man who led the occupation, led the attack, which was a terribly murderous campaign, if you remember 1982. It was really the last time that we had some decent news television in this country. That was when Ted Turner still owned CNN, and Ted Turner's CNN showed what was happening in this war, in real time. And you probably all remember that in 1983, the truck bombs attacked the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the Marine barracks at the airport. And in the attack on the Marine barracks, 241 U.S. Marines were killed. And they were killed by a truck bomb that the Israelis, the Mossad, knew all about. The Mossad knew the type of the truck, where it was being built, what kind of bomb it had, the license plates, everything. But they didn't tell that to the American military. So the American military paid the price in blood. The head of Israeli intelligence said to the other Mossad people, he said, the Americans are a big country. They can take care of themselves. So what it indicates, though, is that the Mossad knew all about the truck bomb. Now, how did the Mossad know all about the truck bomb if they weren't involved in making the truck bomb? And those details can be gleaned from the book by the former Mossad operative agent. His name is Victor Ostrovsky. He's a Canadian. He was a Mossad agent. And he, after his term over there with the Mossad and everything, he came back to Canada and the United States. And I think he lives in Arizona now. And he wrote some books called By Way of Deception and Beyond Deception. And he also wrote a fictional book called The Lion of Judah. And he writes about exactly how the Mossad does these things. And this information is all coming from him. Well, when the Israelis created this doctrine of the war on terror, they needed, obviously, an enemy. You have to have an enemy. So they had to create an enemy because the enemy wasn't there. So they had to create one. And when the Red Army, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, that gave the Americans and the Israelis the opportunity to create this anti-Western force. We began arming, Ronald Reagan and the CIA began arming the Mujahideen, here seen in the Oval Office. And in this operation, which really began with a lot of money in 1983, the CIA was arming the Afghans to fight the Red Army. And the main allies in this operation were Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. And the guy that ran it from the Congress was this man, Charlie Wilson from Texas. He was very, very pro-Israel. And when he got elected to Congress in 1973, he went to Washington, and he came under the wing of the Mossad station chief in Washington, a man named Zvi Rafia. And what happened, if you read the book about Charlie Wilson's war, you'll read that the lion's share of the money from the CIA in Saudi Arabia was given to this group led by this man Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, seen in the lower picture there, with the black beard. And what's peculiar about this is that the CIA and the Mossad were arming the most anti-Western group out there. There were other groups they could have given money to Abdul Haq, who was a very effective Pashtun fighter. Very effective. And yet they didn't give money to Abdul Haq, rather they gave money to this guy's operation, which never had any success in the battlefield, which was known for basically stirring up the other groups, the other Mujahideen groups, and which was the most anti-Western. Why would the Americans and the Israelis be funding and arming the most anti-Western group out there? It doesn't make any sense, unless you consider that what they were really doing is they were creating the enemy for the war on terror, the next war. They were creating tomorrow's enemy. This is how it worked. The Mossad connection, Charlie Wilson was the guy that wanted to defeat the Red Army, wanted to arm these guys, and he was being led by this Israeli head of the Mossad, the man in the lower picture, Zvi Rafia, who was in fact the Mossad station chief in Washington. And what Rafia did is that he used Charlie Wilson's office, congressional office, as if it were his own. This is a quote from the book, Charlie Wilson's War. It says on the lower left, Zvi Rafia always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. One of the staffers kept a list of people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones, give projects to the staff, and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. So this is a case where the Mossad chief was basically using a congressman and his office to accomplish Israeli policy in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And what they did is that the Israelis trained these Afghan fighters. And the Hekmatyar group included a group of Arabs, which are called the Afghan Arabs. These are Arabs who were sent or went to Pakistan in order to fight with the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, of course, were Afghan people, not Arabs. The Arabs were people come from Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries to fight with them in the jihad, right? And what's interesting is that the people who were training this group was Israeli military intelligence. And at the time, 1983, 84, and 85, the man who headed Israeli military intelligence was Ehud Barak, the man who blamed Osama bin Laden. So his men are the ones who trained Osama bin Laden in the beginning. Okay, now 1983, Ehud Barak, this is Ehud Barak as military intelligence chief. He's shaking hands with Ariel Sharon when Ariel Sharon was found guilty of personal responsibility in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila. He had to leave office, he had to give up his defense portfolio, and the Kahan Commission in Israel said that because he was personally responsible for the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, that he should never hold office in Israel again. How many years later? Less than 20 years later, he was elected prime minister of the country. Ariel Sharon became prime minister a few weeks after George Bush finally became president of this country in the winter of 2001. Here is the Mossad's man who trained Osama bin Laden. His name is Ali Mohammed. And he was the first trainer of Al-Qaeda. He's the one who trained Osama bin Laden and al-Zawahiri. He's the one who set up the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Africa. And he was involved in all the Al-Qaeda terrorist activities in the 1980s, like the USS Cole and the African bombings. And what happened is that the United States then held him in a trial, put him in a trial for the bombing of the embassies in Africa, and he was found guilty. And then he was put away in American state penitentiary, federal penitentiary for life or something like that. And then he just disappeared. He's completely disappeared. He disappeared from the American judicial system. He disappeared from the federal penitentiary system like thin air, gone. And what's interesting about this fella is that he was a Hebrew-speaking double agent. Supposedly Egyptian, yet he spoke fluent Hebrew. So he's obviously some sort of triple agent working for the Israelis as well. And you have to understand that when the Israeli military intelligence started training the Al-Qaeda people in Pakistan, the people who became Al-Qaeda, they had to have Arabic-speaking trainers. And that's not a problem for Israel because there's many, many Israelis who were born in places like Morocco or Iraq who speak the language and can appear to be Iraqi or Moroccan or Egyptian very well, but are in fact Israelis. And so Ali Muhammad and the Israelis trained these characters who became Al-Qaeda. First, they were members of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, and then when they lost Saudi support, after they supported Saddam Hussein in 1991, and they lost Pakistani support in 1994, all of that group that the Israelis had trained merged into Al-Qaeda and Taliban. And of course, Al-Qaeda then morphed into ISIS, what we're fighting today. This is how the idea of catastrophic terrorism was pushed on the American intelligentsia through a magazine like this. This is Council of Foreign Relations magazine called Foreign Affairs. And in 1998, Philip Zelikow, the man who wrote the 9/11 Commission report, headed a study group called the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group with Ashton Carter and John Deutsch. Ashton Carter is, of course, today our Secretary of Defense. And in this document that they had published, this is a report of their findings of their study group, they imagined the transforming event. And they talk about that transforming act of catastrophic terrorism that will change America. And I think most of you will agree that America has been gravely changed, profoundly altered by the events of 9/11. And the men that wrote that catastrophic terrorism report, as I said, were Ashton Carter and John Deutsch with Philip Zelikow. Ashton Carter's top left, man in the middle with the blue sweaters, Ashton Carter, former head of the CIA. Now, the important thing about Ashton Carter to understand, if you look at his resume, you will see that his entire life has been spent as an employee of the Rothschild family, which is to say that our defense minister today is basically a Rothschild agent. Now, another group that had a big role in transforming American military policy was this group called Project for the New American Century. And the PNAC people are these people at the bottom here. The Kagan family, Donald Kagan, a Lithuanian-born Jewish fella, Robert Kagan and Fred, and Robert's wife is Victoria Nuland. If any of you recall what happened in Ukraine a couple years ago, the putsch, the coup d'etat that happened in Kiev, that was all the doings of Victoria Nuland. She's Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasia, and she's the person who oversaw the coup d'etat, and she installed the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk in Ukraine that caused almost a war with Russia because Yatsenyuk was strongly anti-Russian, but about 25% of the population of Ukraine is Russian. So that didn't go too well. But these people, this PNAC Kagan family, they drafted a document 1 year before 9/11 in which they called for the United States to occupy Iraq and build permanent bases there, whether Saddam Hussein was on the throne or not. They said that didn't matter. We should do that as policy in the Middle East. And they said the process of transformation, this military transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And this, of course, was the new Pearl Harbor. 9/11 was the terror atrocity that changed America, it changed American foreign policy, and it brought us the war on terror. But as I've tried to make clear now, the war on terror was already like a bonfire that was all built, ready to light, all gassed up, and the enemy was painted on the back wall. They just needed to light it. And this is the spark that lit it. And as I said, Ehud Barak said, now it's time, finally America, now it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. He said that before either building fell, just to give you an indication of how early they did it. And this is something called the primacy effect. When something like this happens, the culprits want to get their narrative out there first, before you have time to even scratch your head and think, who might have done this? Before you even get to that point of thinking, they're telling you who did it. And you'll see it with every terrorism attack, every false flag terrorism attack that happens these days, you'll see they do exactly the same thing. And reading from the Zionist script on 9/11, President Bush said, "Our way of life and our very freedom was under attack." He said, "America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world." Obviously, the terrorists didn't know about places like Switzerland, where there's plenty of freedom and opportunity. And a few days later, on September 20th, 2001, it was 9 days after 9/11, he declared war on terror, saying in Congress, every nation and every region now has a decision to make. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. He basically bifurcated the world into terrorists and U.S. allies. That scared a lot of countries. What I want to point out in this slide, you see the Speaker of the House behind him, who's shaking his hand, clapping his hands. That man is Denny Hastert, and if you're familiar, he's been proven now to be a pedophile who spent millions of dollars trying to keep the young men quiet back in Illinois who he had molested. And I would say that there are probably more men like him in Congress than you understand, than you think. Now, what's the latest phase in this war on terror? These guys, Islamic State. Who are these guys? That's the question. We know that something like 22,000 of these men are all paid mercenaries, which is why they wear the black ski masks, because they have red hair or black skin or white skin, or they don't look like Syrians or Iraqis, because they're not. Many of them, I would presume, are actually Israelis. And these are the people who are running this kind of theatrical band. And it seems like although the United States overthrew the government of Iraq and the military of Iraq in a few weeks, they seem to be at a loss to defeat this little army of guys in Toyota trucks. You know, we've been bombing these guys for over a year, and it doesn't seem to slow them down at all. What's interesting is that everything we know about this group, ISIS, comes to us from an Israeli website called SITE, Intelligence Group, which is based in Bethesda, Maryland. So that the videos, here you can see one of the videos comes from SITE. That's the logo of SITE up there in the upper corner. So what this woman, the woman at the top, her name is Rita Katz. She's an Israeli Mossad agent from Iraq. She runs this little website, and her group has subscribers, and then she sends to her subscribers the video feed and the news about ISIS. So when ISIS releases a video, they release it to her, and then she releases it to BBC and CBS and NBC. And when the second American video was beheaded, her group actually released the video to her subscribers before the beheaders had released the video themselves. So before ISIS had released the video, she had released it to her subscribers. And kind of like caught with their pants down, she spoke on CNN. She said, well, in fact, within a short time after our release, ISIS account on social media indicated that within a short time, they would be releasing the video. Only we actually had the video beforehand and were able to beat them with the release. Now ask yourself, how did this little ISIS, this Israeli intelligence website, how did they have a copy of the video beforehand? As I said, the Israelis or the perpetrators always want to interpret the event for us before we have a chance to do it ourselves. And this is, this is about the Orlando massacre in the club down there. And a couple days after it happened, Netanyahu spoke, and he made like a video giving his interpretation of what was going on in Orlando. Although he's far away, he's not involved in the investigation, he said what happened. He said, this week's shooting wasn't merely an attack on the LGBT community, it was an attack on all of us, on our common values of freedom and diversity and choice. Radical Islamist terror makes no distinction between shades of infidel. This week it was gays in Orlando. A few days before it was Jews in Tel Aviv. All of us are targets. Working together, we can defeat them even faster. You see, so what Israel tries to do all the time is that their basic argument is Islamic terror affects us Israelis because we're Western. We're like you guys. And it's really you guys they hate. They're just attacking us because we're closer. So therefore, you all, Western people, have to help us because we're all in it together. That's the whole game. This is how much it's cost the American taxpayer. These are just the wars, $1.7 trillion. So the 9/11 cover-up is an essential part of the deception that enables the culprits to dupe the American public into supporting the global war on terror. So if the truth about 9/11, if the truth of the deception of 9/11 comes out, then it basically defangs the whole war. That's why they have to maintain this deception. As Richard Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. So the three fundamental aspects of a cover-up, a false flag cover-up. You have to control the investigation and access to the evidence, because that'll obviously show what happened. You also have to control the interpretation, how the event is explained to the public. That's where the media comes in. And you have to control the litigation, the court process, to prevent legal discovery from revealing the truth. So the first part is the controlled investigation of 9/11, or what I call the non-investigation, because you have to understand that 9/11 was never investigated. Imagine that. 3,000 people were killed in New York City, and there was no criminal investigation. You know why? Because they said, the government said, well, they attacked the Pentagon, and that's an act of war. Now, because it's an act of war, we will respond by going to war against the place where those guys came from. Well, they came from Saudi Arabia, but they were at one point in Afghanistan, so we're going to go to Afghanistan, we're going to take over Afghanistan. Now, the people that should have investigated 9/11 are these two characters here. Attorney General John Ashcroft, head of the Department of Justice, and his assistant in charge of the criminal division was this Israeli man here, Michael Chertoff. He's an Israeli-American dual national. His mother was a Mossad agent. Her name was Levia Eisen. And Michael Chertoff was given the authority for the 9/11 investigation. And as I said, for day-to-day decisions, Chertoff has the last word. And what Chertoff oversaw then was the non-investigation and the suppression of the evidence and the information, the factual information. The destruction of the evidence. The steel from the World Trade Center was taken from the World Trade Center 24/7, cut up into small pieces in New Jersey, mixed with other scrap, and sent to China for destruction. So there was no investigation. After this destruction of evidence, he was put in charge of Homeland Security, from which position he maintained his control over the evidence of 9/11. These are the people who wrote the 9/11 Commission report, because there was no investigation, and there was a clamor on the East Coast, particularly from New Jersey, places like that, for an investigation. What the government did is about 2 years later, they installed a 9/11 commission, a politically appointed commission. And they were led by a guy named Philip Zelikow, and they crafted this document called the Commission Report. But the people who worked on this report later said it was completely a hoax. 6 out of the 10 9/11 commissioners went on record saying that it was a U.S. government cover-up. This is John Farmer Jr. speaking, and he said, he was the senior counsel to the commission. He said what government and military officials told Congress, the commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. Here are two of the two co-chairmen, Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton. And Thomas Keane said, to this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. NORAD was the North American air defense system that was in place that day. They were doing drills that day that mimicked what happened. This is the man that wrote the myth, Philip Zelikow, and he was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission report, and he wrote the report. In March 2003, he had completed the outline of the commission report before the staff even began working. Then what he did is he just basically cherry-picked information that would support his outline. This is another man who was involved in the basic cover-up. This is Gene Corley, and he was put in charge of crafting this document, which was the building performance study, basically examining how the towers, how they held up until the point of collapse. That was as far as they went. And this man's from Chicago, and his specialty is concrete. He's actually a concrete guy. And I called him up when he was doing this examination for the document, and I said, are you testing the metal? Are you testing these steel beams for explosives? And he said, I don't know anything about that. He said, I'm not a metallurgist. So the question is, why was he put in charge of this investigation of a steel frame building if he knows nothing about steel? Well, probably for the same reason that he was put in charge of the Waco, Texas operation and Oklahoma City, because he's very good at crafting a report that will bolster the government story. Waco was a cover-up, Oklahoma City was a cover-up, 9/11 was a cover-up, Flight 800 was a cover-up. They go on and on and on. But the 9/11 cover-up is, for me, a bridge too far. When they kill 3,000 people in broad daylight and take the country to war, that's where I drew the line. They don't go. It doesn't go. Another guy who was involved in the cover-up, official cover-up, is this man here. His name is William Jeffrey, formerly Jaffe. And he oversaw NIST. He was the director of NIST when they produced this report, the final report on the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. Now, that first report went up until the point when the buildings began to collapse. Then this report was supposed to take on and explain what caused the collapse. But the problem with this report, it doesn't even look at evidence of explosives or molten metal that was found in great quantities. After he produced that report for NIST, he went on to become the CEO at an R&D, research and development organization called SRI. That stands for Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. And what SRI does, it's a nonprofit research and development organization that creates things like nanothermite for the military. And nanothermite, superthermite, is exactly what was found in the dust of the World Trade Center. So it's not like Mr. Jeffrey doesn't know about this stuff. He knows exactly how to cover it up. And it's interesting, at Stanford Research Institute, where he's the CEO, the person who oversees the laboratory where they make nanothermite is this Israeli fella here on the right, Yigal Dov Blum. And he has been the director and project manager of the laboratory where they make energetic nanocomposite materials since 1984. And another person, this is the local agent of the cover-up, this is Mayor Bloomberg, of course, with the striped tie. And Mayor Bloomberg served 12 years in New York City as the mayor, unprecedented. It was the third term. They changed the law to give him a third term. And what he did in that position is he basically suppressed 9/11 truth from coming up from the firefighters, from the first responders, or from the police department. Here he is in 2008, Christmas, visiting his good friend Ehud Barak, who was involved in something at the time called a war crime called Operation Cast Lead. And during Operation Cast Lead, the Israelis went and bombed the Gaza Strip people, the Palestinians of Gaza Strip, who are in fact basically defenseless population kept in the world's largest open-air prison. And into this open-air prison, the Israelis launched more than lead. They also launched white phosphorus, as you can see from this. And white phosphorus is, of course, an illegal banned weapon because when white phosphorus hits the human body, it just burns right through the body. You can't stop it. Water, nothing will put it out. It's a chemical reaction. And so it's banned. But the Israelis were launching these jellyfish-like artillery shells willy-nilly into the Gaza Strip during that operation. And that was Christmas. That was exactly at the period when George Bush was a lame duck president. Now, as we approach the same thing this year, be very attentive what happens when Barack Obama becomes a lame duck president and our next president is just president-elect. This is kind of like a period when it's a free fire zone because the president is no longer willing to do anything, really, and the president-elect, like Barack Obama said, he was asked about the Israeli war crimes in Gaza Strip, and he said, I'm just the president-elect right now, so it wouldn't be proper for me to speak about it right now. But he said, I'll have plenty to say when I become president. When he became president, he said nothing. Absolutely nothing. Here's Mr. Bloomberg, cuddling up with his Bibi Netanyahu friend. And here they are in New York on September 22nd, 2011, basically 10 years after 9/11, looking at the newly built memorial. And in this video, Mr. Netanyahu wanted to see the names of the 4 Israelis. He wanted to hear the stories of the 4 Israelis whose names are etched in the stone there. I would point out that of the 4,000 Israelis who were expected to have been at the World Trade Center that day or the Pentagon, only 4 died. Now, the next aspect, the aspect that's really important for us, is controlling the interpretation. The interpretation of any event that we hear about basically comes to us from the media. And in this country today, 95% of the media outlets are owned by 6 corporations. So we have a consolidation. The media is consolidated in this country like it has never been before in a so-called democratic country. The consolidation of the media in this country is more like the Soviet Union was in the Soviet times. We have 6 companies who basically give us everything that we read, see, or hear in the media. And one of the biggest, of course, is this man, Rupert Murdoch. And he was created by the Rothschilds in Australia. He was created as a media mogul down there and then sent to the United States to buy up American media properties. And I happened to have the opportunity to ski with him one day in Aspen, Colorado when I was a ski guide. And I talked to him about his media acquisitions. What I didn't ask him, which I should have asked him, is where's the money come from? And as we now know, as I'm showing you, the money actually comes from the Rothschilds. And what the Rothschilds do is they create these media moguls in order to control public opinion. So for example, in 2003, when the United States prepared to go into Iraq on the occupation phase, he owned 160 newspapers in this country. And every single editor of every single paper that he owned agreed that we should invade Iraq. Now, the invasion of Iraq is, of course, a massive war crime. And as the British have now determined, Tony Blair should be held accountable for war crimes. Of course. We need something like that in this country. Now, the New York Times is a family-owned paper. It's owned by the Sulzberger Ox family. And this is a family that's very closely tied to the Zionist establishment. They are one of the founding families of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith is a Zionist Freemasonic organization, secretive, which is only open to Jewish men who are Zionist. And so the New York Times is really like B'nai B'rith Times. And on September 11, 2004, 3 years after 9/11, they had this most bizarre lead editorial, the public knowledge of 9/11. And the first sentence is the most peculiar sentence I've ever seen. It says, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. And they expect the New York Times audience, the New York Times readers to go away, okay, we know what happened, but we don't know what happened. We'll accept that. And it says at the end, some of what we need to know publicly has been provided by the report of the 9/11 Commission. Other answers are lacking. Like what happened to this building. This is Building 7, 47-story building, owned by Larry Silverstein, and at 5:23 in the afternoon, this building simply fell down into its footprint with no explanation. There were some small office fires in this building, that's true. It had some slight damage from falling debris, that's true. But there were explosions that went off in this building before either tower fell. And there were dead bodies in this building, and this building also housed the Office of Emergency Management for New York City on the 23rd floor. They had a hardened bunker that was resistant to even a nuclear blast. And most likely, the people who pulled the towers 1 and 2 were on that 23rd floor. Then they had to destroy the evidence. But in any case, this was the third tower that fell that day. Larry Silverstein's third candidate, a trifecta, a perfect trifecta for him. And it's interesting, I talked to the insurance company that insured this building, and they paid for this building without knowing what happened to it. I said, why did you do that? They didn't give me a good answer. It's Teachers Insurance in Kansas. Now, this is the World Trade Center Memorial, and lo and behold, this was also built for us by an Israeli. This is the architect. His name is Michael Arad. And he's no small player. His daddy was the Israeli ambassador to the United States. And of all the people that submitted, designs, they chose his design. And so the Israelis also have created then for us the legacy, the memorial, the museum. The carved in stone aspect of 9/11 was designed for us by this young Israeli fella. So what I want to point out here is that at every crucial point in this 9/11 saga, you find an Israeli or a person who's serving the Israelis making the key decision that will become history. Now, the American people have doubt the 9/11 narrative. They doubt it very much. And this is the most generous, most generous poll, which finds that 40% of the people believe the official account. But that means that 60% do not believe it. Now, the last aspect of the cover-up is the litigation. You have to cover up you have to control the legal process, the court trials that happen as a result. Now, there were, of course, 3,000 wrongful death cases on 9/11. The first 2,900 were settled out of court when the people simply took the money that was given to them by the U.S. compensation. And when they signed the dotted line and took the check, they signed away their rights to have any litigation further. But there were 96 families who held out for a process. They wanted to find out in a court of law who was responsible for the loss of their loved one. And they had every right to do so. And of those 96 people, they were all settled out of court. And this was a process that was headed by this judge, Alvin K. Hellerstein, a federal judge, U.S. federal judge in Manhattan. And I discovered a really serious conflict of interest here, because the key defendant in the tort litigation was an Israeli Mossad company called ICTS, based in Holland. And it's called International Consultants on Targeted Security. And that company, that Israeli security company, owned a little company called Huntley USA, which was the company that screened the passengers on 9/11 at Logan Airport, Newark Airport. So if these characters, if these 19 Arabs got on the plane with box cutters and all that kind of stuff, they had to go through Israeli security. So the Israelis would have had to explain how these guys got on the plane, show the videos of them getting on the plane, you know. But the problem was that the judge's son works for that company in Israel. But it didn't stop this. And what the judge did, what Judge Hellerstein then did, is that he oversaw the process where one by one, each one of those 96 families was settled out of court until there were none left standing. So that means that there will never be a trial for 9/11 in this country, because everybody that had standing has taken the money and gone home. And this is all done through these characters here. This is Kenneth Feinberg, the special master. He's the one who doled out the government money for the first 2,900 families. And then the 96 families that were left over were dealt with by Sheila Birnbaum. And Sheila Birnbaum settled each one out of court. And what's interesting in this is when the families sign the dotted line, there's a gag order in there that they cannot talk about anything about their settlement. So they take the money and then are sworn to silence. And these two people, as are the judges, they're all closely tied to the state of Israel. And here's another guy, Michael Mukasey, another judge, goes to the same congregation as Judge Hellerstein. And this man is important because he oversaw the 1993 bombing in the World Trade Center when there was a truck bomb. The FBI was involved in putting a truck bomb in the building. And that case was prosecuted by Michael Chertoff. So Michael Chertoff was the prosecutor from New Jersey in that trial. And this judge oversaw it. And what they basically did is the FBI had paid $1 million to an Egyptian colonel, and that Egyptian colonel was the informant, Saddam. And he had gotten into his orbit some Egyptian fellas, and basically entrapped them into this plot. They didn't do anything, but they were trapped in the plot. And so that when the crime happened and the process happened, they were found guilty. You have to understand that the FBI lately, in the last 20 years, is no longer a Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's a Federal Bureau of Instigation, in that it instigates and entraps people in culpable positions where they can be held responsible for crimes they didn't do. And it's happened so many times in the last 10 years, it's unbelievable. So the question is, what are they covering up? Well, the government and controlled media are suppressing 9/11 evidence that would expose the official myth as a pack of lies. And they do this in order to protect the real culprits from being identified. Because if you understood what really happened on 9/11, you would understand that there's no way that Osama bin Laden and a bunch of Arabs did this, that this was in fact a very sophisticated operation. And after 9/11, I went to Germany because I was writing about 9/11 from my home in Chicago, pointing out all the holes in the story. And I felt, how safe can I be doing this when the government is going to war based on these lies? And if I'm exposing these lies, I said, that's not very safe. So I decided to relocate to Germany. And in Germany, I was lucky to meet, in the very first week, 3 former heads of German intelligence who spoke to me. The first one said that 9/11 to him looked like a Hollywood production. That's very true. Then I spoke to this man, Wertebach, and he said that the deathly precision and magnitude of planning behind the 9/11 attacks would have needed years of planning. Such a sophisticated operation would require the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization. So, what state would he be referring to? What state are we talking about? Here's another man I spoke to, Andreas von Bülow, and he told me on 9/11, he said that right at the outset when I asked him, who do you think's behind it, without flinching, he said, looks like it was a Mossad operation. And I printed that, I reported that, and it was printed in my newspaper in Washington, D.C. And he was a little bit flabbergasted. I spoke to him later that my magazine, my newspaper had printed that. Because he said, he has told that to every German journalist that spoke to him, but it was never printed in Germany. Because in Germany, it's forbidden to point fingers of any wrongdoing at the state of Israel. So he told me, Andreas von Bülow told me that you don't get the higher echelons. That is the architectural level. There's the architectural level planners of such a crime, and they designed the crime to be blamed on their enemy in order to affect public opinion. So that we, like in this case, the United States, the crime was carried out in New York, the blame was immediately attached to Arabs and Muslims who were based in Afghanistan. So we willingly allowed our nation to go to war in Afghanistan, thinking that we were curing the problem. But we didn't realize we were all being misled down this path to hell. And the second level he calls the managerial level. And these are the people who manage the setting up of the crime and then the covering up of the crime. And the third level, he said, this is the working level. And the working level, he said, is part of the deception. And that would be like the 19 Arab hijackers. That would be like Lee Harvey Oswald. That would be like Sirhan Sirhan. These are the guys that get caught and blamed. And Andreas von Bülow told me that 95% of the work of intelligence agencies around the world is deception and disinformation, which is widely propagated in the mainstream media, creating an accepted version of events. He said, journalists don't even raise the simplest questions. Those who differ are labeled as crazy. Like here are these 19 hijackers, and 15 of them lived in Florida, in South Florida. What's interesting here is that at least 6 of them had been issued duplicate licenses. And if you read the Florida press how this happened, like one of these characters would go into the DMV and get a license on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, they would call, or somebody in their name would call and say, hello, I'm Muhammad Atta, and I just got my license yesterday. But I moved this morning. I moved to a new house. I have a new address. So can you send me a new license to my new address? And they did it. And so you had basically 2 people in Hollywood, Florida, or Delray, going around with the same ID, different addresses, but the same name. And then many of these guys had also reported lost passports. So what we're dealing with is a situation where there are duplicate documents in the same name. And duplicate documents like this are used to create false histories. To understand how the Mossad leaves a false trail for a person they want to pin terrorism on, I recommend reading this book, The Little Drummer Girl. It's available in any library. It's written by John le Carré, the famous British spy master. The book came out in 1982 or 83, and he wrote it in 82, and it was written with the help of Israeli military intelligence, former heads of Israeli military intelligence, which he gives credit to in the very first page. And in the book and in the movie, Diane Keaton plays this British actress who is used to befriend a Palestinian person, a leader, a Palestinian leader, who then makes his way across Europe, leaving a trail in his name. And then in the end, there's a bombing in a synagogue in Germany. He's blamed for it, and while he's dead already. And then there's a car blows up on the Autobahn at a Tankstelle in Germany, and he, of course, is in the trunk of the car, blown to pieces. This is exactly what they're doing now. And so if you want to understand how they leave a false trail, like for those 19 Arabs in Florida, I recommend reading this book because it's a little complicated. It's not something that most Americans think about doing, but what you're doing is you're simply laying a trail of false evidence that will be picked up by investigators later on and used to pin the tail on the wrong guy. Oh, and in the book, the head Mossad guy says to Diane Keaton, the character, he says, terror is theater. Theater's a con trick. Do you know what that means, con trick? You've been deceived. Now, when you go home tomorrow or tonight and you see that another act of terrorism has occurred, keep those words in mind, terror is theater. And ask yourself, does the evidence that we're seeing, does it match the crime? I mean, just for San Bernardino, for example. Some of you watched San Bernardino shooting that happened a couple months ago. And if you saw TV that day, some of the eyewitnesses appeared on national TV. And one woman said there were 3 shooters, and they were all tall white guys. She said they were tall white guys dressed in black who were buffed and looked like they really knew what they were doing. And the newscaster on NBC or something said, "What you mean there were 3?" And he says, yes. She said, yes, there were 3 tall white guys dressed in black. Well, who was shot at the end of the day and blamed? A small Pakistani girl, brown-skinned Pakistani girl. And her body and her boyfriend, her husband's body, were found on the street in San Bernardino going back to the scene of the crime, and they were in handcuffs, and their bodies were found on the street dead. And they were blamed. I mean, that operation, the evidence does not fit the crime. And this is what happens all the time. We, however, we're at a distance. We were not in Marseille or Nice. We don't know what happened in Nice. We don't know what happened in Orlando. We have to rely on what we can glean from the media. And sometimes there are bits of information that come through the media that are truthful and indicate that, wait, it doesn't fit. Boston bombing, for example, the marathon bombing, remember that? Well, they blamed the Chernayev brothers, right? Well, one Chernayev brother was dead, and the other brother, the younger brother, Dzhokhar Chernayev, well, we see pictures of him at the Boston Marathon, and he's carrying a clearly white backpack. Nothing dark about it at all. His backpack was silver or white. And yet, the FBI director or the FBI investigator said the day after the attack, the day after the bombing, he said very clearly that both devices were packed in black nylon backpacks. Well, why is Joker Chernayev even a suspect then? Because his backpack was white. You see? So again, they're pitting the tail on the wrong donkey. Now here's 9/11, and I'm just going to address a few of the most outrageous anomalies about 9/11, the things that indicate that we have been given a pack of lies. This is the plane that is said to be United Airlines Flight 175 hitting the South Tower. But United Airlines, of course, at that time, and I think still today, had dark blue undercarriages. Dark blue. This one is gray. Furthermore, this one has a groove down the middle of the bottom of the fuselage, which indicates that it's a 767 tanker aircraft, most likely. Painted gray. And as you can see, this plane has been weaponized. This plane has a missile attached to the bottom of the fuselage, that shiny thing. And just before the plane hit the building, South Tower, that pod, or that shiny thing on the bottom, emitted what appears to be a missile that went into the building. Here you can see this flash. Both planes did the same thing, actually. But this plane was photographed from more angles, and so it's more obvious. And what you can see is that this object was fired from beneath the bottom of the plane, and it went faster than the plane, and it made a hole in the front of the building, in the side of the building, just before the plane hit. And as you can see, this hole that it's made in the side of the building is white hot, and it's about the size of the fuselage. So clearly this would allow that fuselage of the plane to enter the building without any resistance. But it's white hot, which strongly suggests that this is a depleted uranium warhead, because depleted uranium burns in the air white hot, and when it hits something, it goes right through metal like a warm knife through butter. It just goes right into the metal, and it gets even hotter when it hits something. It's white hot. It happens to be the silver bullet that America uses all the time, so the more you know about it, the better. And as I said, well, if a DU warhead hit the building, then we must see it coming out the other side. And lo and behold, let's see the pointer works. There it is. That white hot object that's coming out there is coming out with great momentum, and it's burning white hot. There's actually two objects coming out here. The other one is here, but it's burning with quite different characteristics. And here again, you see it against the blue sky. Very, very hot. It's certainly not part of the plane. And here again, you see it coming out, and you see here that it's burning white hot, and there's a gap here. And the reason why there's a gap is because the oxides are so hot that they have to cool down before they become visible. And I did a lot of work on depleted uranium, so I contacted my mentor at Lawrence Livermore. His name is Marion Falk. And he is a scientist who's worked with all of these atomic things in the United States since the Manhattan Project. And he worked from the Manhattan Project all the way through Star Wars, and he made the projects work. And he taught me everything he knew about depleted uranium. And I asked him, Marion, does this object have the characteristics of a DU warhead? And he said, yes, it does. And now another odd thing is that this is the entry point where the plane went into the building, right here. This is the entry point. But you see this reaction here, this explosion. This is not burning jet fuel. This is something explosive. It's burning extremely hot, and it's causing a white smoke. And these are the first explosions that came out the other side of the building. And you see here, these white clouds of smoke are the first thing that happened. That's indicative of thermite, because when thermite burns, it creates a white smoke. That's aluminum oxide. So it looks like that missile, when it went through that 82nd floor, which was a computer floor, only computer equipment, only big computer boxes were on that floor, Fuji Bank's computer center, that there were pre-placed explosive packages of thermite, and the DU warhead ignited them. That's what it looks like happened. And similarly, the same thing happened at this tower. The plane went into this floor, and this was also a computer center belonging to Marsh McLennan. And they had the north side and the east side. And here on the east side, you see this. The plane went that way, but there's a tremendous explosion coming out the east side of the building, which is quite white, like a bale of cotton. Now we see an actual thermite reaction occurring. This again is coming from the floor that the South Tower was struck. This is the Fuji Bank floor. And we see here a thermitic reaction occurring right here. And this 81st floor has apparently buckled, and this kind of thermetic reaction is becoming quite apparent. And here you see this white smoke. This is coming from that reaction. This is an extremely hot reaction. Its minimum temperature is about 2,500 degrees Celsius. It's thermetic reaction. And when that happens, when thermite reacts, it creates that white smoke, incredibly hot temperatures, and molten metal. The oxidizing element here becomes molten metal. This is molten iron. And it's pouring off the floor, and it's coming from a window that's 2 feet across. So that means that tons and tons of this stuff had been placed on that floor. And a guy who worked for Fuji Bank computer room, he contacted me a couple years later, and he told me that there was a strange thing about that floor, he said, was that in the summer before 9/11, large black boxes, like twice the size of this podium, were being brought in at nighttime into the computer room floor. And they were told, the workers were told, that these were batteries for the backup batteries for the computer system. But he said the strange thing was they were never plugged in. So I suspect that those large boxes were containing thermite, and that those were the pre-placed explosives, because obviously from this, we're talking about tens of tons of thermite just on that one floor. And after 7 minutes of that flowing, cascading molten iron, the whole building went kaboom. And as you can see, this is not a gravity collapse. You're seeing pieces of the building being thrust sideways hundreds of meters, hundreds of yards. So the buildings were basically like exploding from the top down. And here we see these pyroclastic flows. And I say pyroclastic because they're like volcanic flows. When like Mount St. Helens went off, the clouds of dust that flowed contained molten lava. In this case, it's not molten lava, it's molten iron. And these were extremely hot, and the buildings were completely pulverized. The dust of the World Trade Center, the essence of the World Trade Center, the concrete, and the people who were in the building were reduced to absolute dust. They didn't find anything. They found very, very little of the human beings left. But in the dust of the World Trade Center, they found this. They found these, you can see these are these iron-rich spheres. These are tiny balls of iron, like smaller than 1 millimeter in size. And you can see here, there's lots of them. There are lots of them. The dust is full of them. And these were created during the destruction of the World Trade Center. During the destruction of the World Trade Center, whatever destroyed the World Trade Center created lots and lots of these, billions of these tiny balls of molten iron. Well, as you can see, the temperature required to make these tiny balls is at least 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. And burning jet fuel or office fires cannot possibly produce molten iron, but thermite can. That's what thermite produces. And now this is why the government reports have ignored the evidence from the crime scene. And when we made this discovery, I worked with the people who made this discovery, and I wrote about it, talked about it. We were attacked because this was a discovery that was not supposed to be made. And when it was made, they had to attack the messengers. They attacked Professor Jones, they attacked me within a 3-week period in 2006. Now, this is a very interesting little critter. This is a molybdenum sphere. But you'll see that molybdenum has one of the highest melting temperatures on the periodic table, 4,753 degrees Fahrenheit. That means that temperatures at least that hot were reached in some parts of the demolition of the World Trade Center. Now, the reason I want to point that out is I want to point out that the destruction of 2,700 lives at the World Trade Center was in fact an American Holocaust, and that it was these people were being cooked alive in extremely hot temperatures, which is why people that were trapped in the towers, one lady called 911, and she said, "It's very hot in here." And 911 said, "No, ma'am, don't worry, you'll be all right. Help's on the way." And she said, No, you don't understand. It's very, very hot. Which is why all the people went to the broken windows and to the entry. They were standing where the planes had come in the building. The people were standing there, expecting that a helicopter was going to land on the roof and break. You have to understand, the doors to the roof were locked. If you ever hear about the Iroquois Theater disaster back in the old days, the owners of that theater were held criminally responsible because in the old days they would lock theater doors. The theater caught on fire and the people all died. That was a huge crime. Here, in this case, you had 2,700 people trapped in the building, and the doors to the roof were locked. Why? Why has Larry Silverstein not been held accountable for that? And why did not any of these American military helicopters simply land on the roof, bust the doors open, and take some people out? Because those people could not go down. They could only go out the top. The top was locked. No attempts were made to rescue those people. And they were being cooked alive. Cooked alive. So they went to the open air windows, the new open air windows, and they stood there, and then they decided, what do I do? Do I stay here and get cooked, or do I jump to my death? And at least 250 of them jumped to their deaths. 250 people jumped to their deaths. And a New York firefighter down below said, he said, you have to imagine how bad it was up there, that the better option was to jump. But 250 jumped. Now this is to point out, the fact that this was from the U.S. Geological Survey of the Dust. This was not put in the final edition of the paper, but I want to point out that this is proof, this and the tiny molten balls is proof that the destruction of the World Trade Center was in fact a very hot event. Judy Wood, a year after we made these discoveries, Judy Wood came out with a book called What Happened to the Towers. And in that book she says the destruction of the World Trade Center, she says, was a cold event. She said that there were some sort of like Buck Rogers type beam weapons that caused the molecules to disassociate and crumble. Complete nonsense. But this proves that the destruction of the World Trade Center was in fact a very hot event. What she's trying to do is cause a red herring to lead people to think to lead them away from the understanding of what thermite does. Now, where did this little molybdenum ball come from? Most likely from this form of thermite right here at the top. Aluminum and molybdenum trioxide. And as you can see, these first four are thermites. These bottom four are high explosives. And this chart shows the potential, the energy that's released from thermite compared to high explosives. And this is just from the U.S. Department of Defense Energetics Center. And they say here, the key point, potential exists to increase kinetics by size reduction. Here we're talking about thermites that are created using like powders in the form like granular powder, like sand on a beach. But if you make the same explosive, the same incendiary, using nano-sized particles, this is extremely small particles, then you increase greatly what they call the surface area of the reaction. So that in a very short period of time, you have an immense reaction, which makes it explosive, which makes it extremely powerful. So nanotechnology changes completely the potential of these thermites. Here we have evidence of a thermite cutter charge. These are the box columns, and each building had 47 of these box columns that were basically like the stems of a flower. These stems held up the gravity load of the building. And the only way that the towers would fall would be that if all 47 of these towers were cut in this manner. And here we see one that has been cut with what appears to be a cutter charge that acts like a warm knife through butter and cut the column at a slope at an angle like that so that it simply slid down. And all 47 of these columns had to fail at the same time for the buildings to fall. This is the nanothermite that was found in the dust of the World Trade Center. And when it was first discovered, they thought it was some sort of paint because it was silver on one side and red on the other. But when they heated it up to 430 degrees, it would detonate and release more energy per gram than any known explosive. And it would produce a little tiny ball of iron. And this was discovered by a professor at BYU and a team of scientists. They found it, and this is what they found in the dust. This is the material. It's a bilayered material. It's got a red layer here and a gray layer here. And in this, it's a matrix. It's called a matrix. Inside this, they mix the reacting elements like aluminum and iron oxide, and then they could insert other things in there like organic compounds to create the gas. And that's what created the explosive, because the reaction burns, it hits the organics, creates gas, and you have an explosion. And when it burns, it burns faster than the speed of sound, which is what makes it explosive. Now they put so much of this thermite stuff in the building, like what we saw coming from the 82nd floor of that building, 81st floor of that building, that it continued to react under the pile for weeks and months later. The fires were not put out at the World Trade Center until Christmas of 2001. And so that for 3 months, the rubble smoked like this. There's a very thin blue smoke. But this smoke, the EPA said, no problem. Christy Todd Whitman said, no problem, the air is safe to breathe. That was a blatant lie. This smoke contained huge amounts of nanoparticles. Again, the very, very small particles. Now that makes the smoke very, very toxic, because a nanoparticle is so small, it's smaller than 1/10 of a micron, a millionth of a meter in size. It's so small that when you inhale nanoparticles, they don't stop in your throat or your lungs or your capillaries. They're so small that they permeate through every membrane of the body until they reach the nucleus of the human cell. And when they lodge in the nucleus of the human cell, that's where they start wrecking the human system. And they cause cancers. And it was like these poor guys that were working on the pile, they were looking for their comrades. Thomas Cahill from UC Davis, who analyzed the smoke, he said it was like they were working inside the stack of an incinerator. And so that 1,600 of these men now have already perished of cancer because they were exposed to the smoke. And this catastrophe, this loss of life, had to be suppressed by the mayor of New York, by the EPA. And Thomas Cahill, who sent the Davis drum to New York, which measured the smoke, which made this discovery, when he went to New York in October of that year, he was met at the airport in New York by the EPA, and they said, who asked you to do this, and who's paying for it? And they were ticked off because they were doing nothing. And his independent research of the smoke proved that the EPA was lying. Now you can imagine, this opens the door for a huge class action suit by these firefighters and firemen and policemen and the public of New York who have gotten sick as a result. And as they removed the rubble from the World Trade Center, they found that it was extremely hot below the surface. It was like a foundry. And the firefighters said that, you'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava. Well, what created such high temperatures that steel, iron, was in the molten state? Well, in 2002, I called up to the people who were removing the rubble, and the only one who would talk to me was the American guy. There were 4 companies involved. One was American, Peter Tully. And he told me that when they got down to the bedrock of Manhattan, there were 7 basement levels. When they finally got down to the bottom, the bedrock of Manhattan, he said there was molten, he called it steel, molten steel in the molten state. And this was 5 weeks after 9/11. And it was confirmed by another guy, Loiseau, who was involved in the removal of the rubble. And here you see a picture. Here's a picture that shows very clearly there is a pool of molten iron there. And I asked Loiseau, Mark Loiseau from Controlled Demolition, I said, how can you explain molten iron in the molten state in the bedrock of Manhattan, 5 weeks later? And he said, think about all the paper that fell down the elevator shafts. Now, another strange thing that happened that day is this destruction. This is Building 6, WTC 6, and it's also known as the U.S. Customs House. And I think it's 6 stories above the surface here and a couple of basement levels. And this is before, if you can see that the street here is clean. And so this is before either tower has fallen, 1 or 2. Building 7 is this one here across the street, and over here is Building 1. And so this building, though, has had a tremendous explosion in it before either tower fell. And here you can see a little bit later, one of the towers has fallen, the street's all cluttered, and you can see the destruction that this building has gone through. And there's been an explosion on the north side of the building here that's opened the front of the building there. And this is the building we're talking about, right here, U.S. Customs House. And as you see, 7 was here, 1 was here. As you can see, there's a huge crater in the middle of the building. What caused that crater? And when was that crater formed? It appears that the crater was formed about the same time that the South Tower was hit by a plane, approximately 9:03 in the morning. And what's interesting is that this down here in this building here, in the sub-basement level, was the vault, the evidence vault. And in this vault was the criminal evidence from Enron, WorldCom, and securities like the Black Eagle Trust that George Herbert Walker Bush had created. He created basically $200 billion in securities to overthrow the Soviet Union in 1991, to undermine the Soviet economy, the Russian economy. And those securities, that $200 billion worth of securities, was coming due on September 11th, 2001. So it looks like a lot of evidence and a lot of criminal evidence was in this vault. And as we now know from the FEMA videographer, he went down there with his video camera and he found that that vault had been broken open during the night and the vault had been cleaned out the night before. So it's important to understand that 9/11 was like a crime within a crime within a crime. You can go on and on and on. There were a lot of crimes involved that day. For example, they found that there were convoys of gold being moved between 4 and 5 here underneath the surface there. They have tunnels and things. and there were 2 trucks full of gold. They were trying to get the gold out of the World Trade Center. Something didn't work that day. Something didn't work that night. They had to leave the gold behind. But there was the night before, the rats were getting all the gold and evidence out of the place before 9/11, and then they destroyed everything. And at the Pentagon as well, we're told, Secretary Rumsfeld said on September 10th, he made a press conference, and he said that $2.3 trillion is missing from the defense budget. $2.3 trillion with a T was unaccounted for. And the department of the U.S. Navy that was looking for it was in this area that was hit by a missile. And this had all been newly renovated by a company called AMEC, a British company. And we're told that the plane came across the lawn like this and went into the building. But we don't see any hole in the building that would accommodate the plane, nor do we see any parts of the plane on the lawn. So where'd the plane go? And furthermore, these cable spools are about 9 feet high, and they are standing directly in the path of the plane. And we're told, this is from the NIST document about the Pentagon, we're told that this nose of the plane, and this is called the fuselage, we're told that this fuselage came through like a cookie cutter and came through here and made a hole in the wall. But the problem is with that is that these colorful columns here are still existing. So you can see between the nose of the plane and the hole in the wall, there are columns that shouldn't be there, but they are there, which indicates that the plane didn't do a cookie cutter job and make this hole. That's a dream. What probably caused this hole is probably some sort of warhead that went through the building and hit the thing and made a giant hole on inside the ring. And what's interesting about this hole is that this entire area of the Pentagon, was the FBI locked it off from the engineers. So the engineers that wrote that report were not allowed into this area of the Pentagon, probably because they would have seen things that would not fit with the official version. So the FBI said, no engineers allowed, FBI only. And these are the men, the first responders that went into the Pentagon, and as you can see, they were prepared for going into a contaminated environment. They were prepared for going into a really toxic place. And when they came out of that toxic place, they were all washed down, decontaminated like this. Their boots were washed, everything was taken, cleaned off. Because they knew that what had happened to the Pentagon had left behind a very deadly residue. Now this is the final slide. This is the final part of this presentation. And I'm showing this is the hole in Shanksville because it's symbolic of the huge hole that we've been given for 9/11, about 9/11. It's just a big pack of lies. In this case, we were told that a large Boeing aircraft went into this hole, leaving, again, no parts of itself behind. And I went to the local paper here, and I spoke to the editor, and I said, I'd like to come and talk to you about how your paper has handled this event, the local paper, yeah? And the editor said, okay, come in on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. So I came in on Tuesday to the paper. He met me. He took me into a back room, and he sat me down at a table with a U.S. military intelligence officer. And his name was Labor Knight. And I said, why am I talking to you? And he said, I've been seconded to the paper to answer your questions. So I said, okay, can you explain to me why we see no parts of an airplane in this hole? And he said, well, it's very simple, he said. He said the ground was very soft, and the plane came very fast, and when the plane hit the ground liquefied and swallowed the plane. And so I asked him what he was smoking. But he told me, he said one wing bounced and went a half mile in the woods. So the ground swallowed the plane, but one wing bounced a half mile in the woods. Huh? This is pure fantasy. But this is courtesy of the U.S. military. And so what he's talking about the plane bouncing and the wing bouncing in the woods is because, as you can see, there was nothing here in this hole. It was only 20 feet across. And I spoke to the county coroner. His name is Wally Miller. And in Pennsylvania, the county coroner has jurisdiction over a crash site. And what the FBI asked Wally Miller at the very beginning is they said, Wally, are you going to be a team player? Which meant, are you going to give us custody of the crash site while you sit in a reception center 9 miles away and answer questions for the media and the public and the relatives? So he did that. And about a half a mile in the woods, further in this area, back here was the actual crash site. And that's where the FBI was picking up pieces and body parts, what have you, and only FBI personnel were allowed there. And later I spoke to the man who owned that property, and he had 3 cabins there. The family had to leave while the FBI was working. They couldn't go back to their cabins for weeks. And his name was Reverend Hoover. He was a Lutheran minister. And I said, Reverend Hoover, can you tell me why you have not been upfront with the American people and told the people that the crash site was actually in the woods around your property? And he said, well, I was just trying to cooperate. And that's what what's happened to everybody in Shanksville. The FBI has told everybody, are you going to cooperate with us? And if you have a choice, you cooperate or you get criminally prosecuted. So everybody chooses to cooperate. But that's the end of the program. And the question that always comes up usually is people say, well, what can we do? You've given us some information to chew on, but what can we do with this? Where do we go? Well, it's basically like this. The war on terror is meant to cause distress, confusion, and fear as it enslaves us and our nation to an open-ended criminal war agenda. To accept it without resisting is not rational. To do nothing is not an option. So this is what we can do to help ourselves and others and to maintain our own sanity. 1, inform yourself so you can help undeceive others. And a good way to inform yourself is to read the first book at least, because you will understand exactly, this is 12 years of research in these books, and it's very hard to present, that kind of information in a short presentation like this. But if you understand the deception, then you have basically defanged the war. And so then, organize with other people, dedicated to truth and peace, and 3, act. Take meaningful action, like the people who helped me organize this event here. Take action so that we can expose the deception and stop the war on terror.